What is the meta? Well, I have a particular perspective of meta because I work in type theory. And in type theory, we work on meta theorems and meta theory and all that stuff. It's quite interesting. You might want to look up things like proof theory or like model theory if you're interested. But presumably, I'm not here to give you a lecture on meta in the context of type theory. I'm here to talk about meta in the context of EU4. What is meta here? Well, I did some brief search, and it seems like in a sort of purist definition, meta, as it pertains to a game, is short for metagaming, which would literally mean gaming about gaming, I guess, which, in my opinion, is nonsensical. But the way I see it interpreted is essentially strategizing or theory crafting. Okay, meta sounds fancy, and the English language or any language evolves over time. So I'm not at all trying to, I guess, gatekeep how language ought to evolve. But I think it's good to recognize that when we say meta, in my opinion, we really are just saying theory crafting. Okay, but I'll still continue to use meta because it seems to be a fairly well understood term that gets thrown around, at least in the EU4 community, but I expect the same in other games as well. Okay, so the question I have is the following. Periodically, you hear someone say, XYZ is the meta, right? You hear that probably in every video game forum, but you hear that in EU4, especially with respect to idea groups, but it can be anything. Okay, so when you see this, for some reason, not many people seem to ask the following questions. Okay, with respect to what? Let me use a shorthand. With respect to what? Okay, and I think that's the biggest question to ask when someone presents a strategy as somehow optimal or optimized or good. Especially in a sandbox game like EU4, I think certain parameters have to be specified. So let's talk about what parameters have to be specified. Well, first of all, goal. As I said, EU4 doesn't have a well-defined notion of a goal. It's a sandbox game, and certain people play EU4 to roleplay. Certain people play it to, I don't know, have like a clean border. Some people play it to conquer the world as quickly as possible. Crazy people. Some people, I don't know, try to optimize their income as much as possible. Sort of that nature. There are various goals in the game. And in fact, in some pedantic sense, even something as dumb as losing as fast as possible is technically a respectable goal, right? So if I present a strategy as follows, unconditionally surrender all your wars. This strategy is, I mean, it's actually not that good at losing as fast as possible because you can just send a peace demand on the first month after you declare war. But this seemingly dumb strategy somehow makes a bit more sense if you accept that this is a reasonable goal. Now, is this goal reasonable? Well, reasonability is something that's hard to precisely define, but I would certainly concede that if you ask the average EU4 player, they would not consider this a reasonable goal. But they would consider something like a world conquest a reasonable goal. They might consider something like having a strong army a reasonable goal. So, in some sense, yeah, it seems like in some intuitive notion of collective mind or agreement of EU4 players, there are certain goals that we accept. Okay, these are here, and there are also goals that, in theory, are goals, but we don't really accept, like this one. And to that, we just have to maybe follow our gut instincts. It just sounds ridiculous for someone to say, I play E4 just to lose as fast as possible. Okay? And then there is some notion of a restriction. So, not using particular exploits would be a restriction, and it's a totally valid restriction. I would say safe scumming is, or not safe scumming is a restriction. Even although I'll talk more about safe scumming in some other video, I think, because I think it's very interesting. Having no loans. Maybe I should write some of these down, right? Like no loans or no allies. These are all well-respected restrictions and certain strategies that are good when you have some allies, might be bad when you don't allow yourself some allies. Same idea with loans, right? And then this is perhaps something akin to an elephant in the room. It's something that clearly exists, yet it's something people don't talk about. I don't like talking about it either, because it's very hard to separate honest discussions of this skill level with a sort of humble brag about one's own skill level. And I will try my best to talk about this without humble bragging or bragging about my skill level, but I think it's sort of a necessary part of discussing this, actually. It's quite difficult to separate the two. Let me give you an example. Certain people value aggressive expansion. I value aggressive expansion, but not as much as most people. Why is that? Well, let's think about why you want to minimize AE, or why you want to stack AE reduction so that you lower AE. Well, coalitions. It's because coalitions are scary in EU4. So by stacking AE reduction, you have a higher threshold on how much base aggressive expansion you can accrue before you get screwed over by coalitions. But having everyone below 50 AE is not the only way to stop coalitions. There are other ways, like truce locking. Okay, you keep everyone over 50 AE with you truced. Now, I say 50 AE, but I lied, right? People with positive opinion won't flip outraged. So maybe I'll call it like diplomat micro. You could have, say, 100 AE on a bunch of people if you're able to micromanage and allocate your diplomat appropriately, such that you do not get them at negative opinion. Okay? Now, these two things require, sadly, maybe skill. Is it skill? Maybe it's fair to say knowledge and commitment. Okay. I think that's a more fair way to state this. These things require more effort than simply stacking a reduction and being below 50A with everyone. But because there are ways to avoid coalitions without stacking a reduction, I value a reductions less than someone who is not comfortable doing these things. And here I say comfortability. It's possible that they know how to do it, they just don't want to because they're lazy, they value their time because they have other things to do in the world, unlike me. Well, I have other things to do in the world as well, but I probably allocate too much time into EU4, for better or for worse. Probably for worse, but at least it lets me rant on YouTube and Apparently, some people are interested in it, which is kind of cool. I think it's pretty cool. Um, anyway, going back to skill level, let's also talk about siegeability. Siegeability is great for speeding up wars. So maybe I'll write like winning wars as like the primary function of siegeability. Well, yeah. Well, I should say winning wars as quickly as possible. I'll just say fast. Um, but yeah, you can win wars without stacking siegeability, and in fact, you can win wars pretty quickly without stacking siegeability. Here's the rule of thumb that I give. I think you can win every war, any war, in 2 years. Okay? Late game Spain with a bunch of colonial nations, I've beaten them in 2 years easily without any like absurd siegeability stacking. Okay? Um, and here actually I should also add like general military buffs. So what enables this, right? This is enabled by two things. Army micro, okay, your ability to micromanage your troops in various fronts simultaneously. This requires not only a lot of knowledge, because you need to understand how attrition works, how reinforcement works, and how fog of war works. It also helps to have an intuitive understanding of how the AI works with respect to war. And this is something that's underrated, but army placement. Okay? If you're, if you're that's China. Is that China? Maybe this is like I don't know. That's China, and this is like Europe, okay? If and you have all your troops here and you declare war here, yeah, it's going to take like 1 year. That's an over exaggeration. It's probably like 5 months. It's going to take a few months to get your troops here. But if your troops are here, it's going to take you, well, maybe like 3 months or 2 months or something. And the point is you save time. And this is actually extremely underrated. I often see people declare wars in a very reactive manner. They see that a truce just came up, so they declare war, and their troops aren't ready. I do that too a lot when I'm being lazy. But really, you should be planning out your wars years in advance and allocating resources appropriately so that your troops or whatever are in position at the time that you're planning to declare war, right? So, all in all, these really do, again, boil down to maybe knowledge and commitment. I'm not sure if I should say knowledge and commitment. It's easier to just say this is skill. In some sense, it is, but it might offend people because there's certainly people who have the knowledge to do it, but don't want to do it. And by saying it's skill, it makes it seem like they're not skilled enough to do it, when maybe the reality is, yeah, they can do it, they just don't want to, or they have other reasons not to. But anyway, so all I want to say is that by you have to assume or fix some notion of skill level or level of commitment on the player's behalf, because certain strategies are better or can only be well executed by good players. Okay? And those are definitely interesting strategies, but so are strategies that are more geared towards beginner players. Things that don't require that much precise intuition about how the game works and how to play out very, very like very small parts of the game, I guess. Okay, so anyway, in the end, the problem with any so-called strategy is the both extremes. Okay, so if you don't fix enough parameters, you can't say much. Okay? Imagine if someone asks you to come up with the best strategy for EU4, period. They don't tell you the goal. They don't tell you what country you're playing. They don't tell you what exploits or strategies you're allowed to use. Yeah, like you can't really say much. This is actually really evident in type theory. Uh, where if you define a function f of type for all alpha, alpha arrow alpha, so that says for any type alpha, you can think of this as a set if you don't know type theory. It's a function that takes in something of type alpha and then returns something of type alpha. Now, this is called parametric polymorphism, and we can prove that there's only one such f that satisfies this type. That's the identity function, f of x equals x. Why? Because this function is so general, right? It says for any type, I will be of this form. And because it's so general, you can't. This is the only thing you can do. Now, suppose we fix a type of alpha, say the natural numbers. So f at nat might look like nat arrow nat. So that is any function that takes in a natural number and then returns some natural number, like n plus 1 or 2 times n. There's a whole family of these things now. So yeah, if you don't fix enough parameters, you're just left with not many things to say, okay? On the other hand, if you fix too many parameters, okay, so you're saying, oh, assume the skill level of the player is XYZ, assume you're playing this country, assume your goal is to world conquest, assuming you're not allowed to use loans, but you're allowed to bird or safe scum, assume, you know, you add all sorts of parameters, and yeah, now you can say a lot about how to optimize the situation, but yeah, now it's too specific, right? It's hard to take the strategy and apply it to someone else's scenario, which might be slightly different. Okay? So, as with almost everything in the real world, okay, the solution is to take some middle ground, some reasonable middle ground between the two extremes. Okay? So, on one hand, you don't want to fix too many parameters because then it's useless. And on the other, you don't want to be too general because then it's useless for a different reason. So you take certain common notions that you think apply to a lot of people. For example, you can set the goal as doing a world conquest. This goal applies to many people. It doesn't apply to all people, so it's not necessarily the most general thing, but it gives you something to work with, right? You could add certain common restrictions. For example, for a restriction, you can add no safe scumming. That's a fairly common and desirable restriction, right? And now you have quite a bit more tools to work with in terms of what you can say and what kind of strategies you're gonna make, I guess, assuming certain things. And so I guess my overall message is the following. The next time you hear someone say, you know, this is the new meta, right? In the context of EU4, well, they're probably wrong. Or let's put it this way. They're either wrong because it's too general, or they frame it as something general, but they implicitly assume a lot of things. This actually happens more often than the former, I think. For example, I think at one point had a discussion. discussion. It's a Reddit comment chain, so it's not really a discussion, but more of I don't know, like a cage battle, where someone claimed that like eco quantity is the best, right? They're like eco quantity is the best idea group in EU4, and well, why is it the best? Because their notion of best was probably something was either maybe for MP in the past, right? That's a certainly like reasonable assumption to have multiplayer. Maybe their assumption was for me. Maybe they weren't really good enough to capitalize on, say, stuff like CCR from admin or war score reduction from Diplo. Maybe they meant best in the sense of while maintaining nice borders. And here they have some, they've internalized their notion of what nice borders even mean in a convenient way such that it rolls out stuff that involves conquering a lot, right? And so on. So, yeah, I would say as a general guideline, keep that in mind. Keep in mind that when discussing the meta or the strategy, you should really think about these parameters. And you should think about whether whatever parameters that they've either stated or implicitly assumed applies to your case. And if it does, then great, you can take it in or think about it, right? And if it doesn't, well, you probably shouldn't take it in. Although you can certainly productively discuss things about it by, assuming the same position that they have. Or you can also claim that the parameters that they assumed are unreasonable, right? So I think that's all I have. Next time, I will talk about the so-called idea group meta. Okay, this is sort of all a precursor and preliminary to my incoming rant on the so-called new idea group meta, where people are flaunting about espionage or offensive or inno, right? I call it the three stooges. Is it stooges or stooges? I think it's stooges. Yeah, espi, inno, and offensive. I call these the three stooges of the idea groups. Not because they're actually that bad. They're actually pretty decent, but because they're certainly overhyped. And I'll explain what I mean by that next time.